It's important to tell the story because slavery has shaped so many aspects of South Africa. I think not only our history, but also if you look at South Africa today, the language Afrikaans comes out of the slave narrative. Racism is something that comes out of course, of slavery. But it's also a message of hope, of how people brought under those conditions have overcome.
One thing that I've noticed is that anytime I do history videos, you guys are not interested. But I will never stop doing it because if you don't know your history, you definitely don't know where you're going. I believe that this is a history that so many Africans are not aware. So don't go anywhere, watch till the end. Make sure you like this video, subscribe and be part of this awesome channel. But the most important thing is feel free and share this video.
Welcome to Cape Town. This is one of the best cities in the world.
It is a city which is scooping awards year in, year out. That, is all over. Through Google, you can check for the information, you'll find it.
One thing that I love about Cape Town is the history behind it, the beauty of where it started.
And this same beautiful city got one of the darkest history in the world. And I believe that so many people that visit and live in here have no idea about this city's history. And since I found myself in here as an African travel creator, it is my responsibility to use my platform to educate myself and you, because when I got here, I was extremely shocked to see that this is the history behind this beautiful city.
All these roads that you see here, the harbor was built by slaves.
So are you trying to say Cape Town was built by slaves?
Yes. Because remember the settlers didn't work. They made the slaves work for them. And that's why Cape Town looks like this today, because of the slaves.
Who would have thought? Did you know? Let me know in the comment section. And if you don't know, why don't you like this video, subscribe and be part of this awesome channel. Stay tuned as I continue to educate you about Cape Town. The history of South Africa is really long and complex, and it all started from Cape Town. Cape Town was first the home of the Khoisan.
The original owners of this land are people who are called the Khoisan. They are made out of two groups, the Khoikhoi and the San, who survived through hunting and gathering.
In 1647, the Dutch East Indian Company ship crashed at the Table Bay, which marks the first entry of the Dutch at the Cape.
So now, as one of their ships was sailing all the way from Netherlands to India, sailed past Tableview. It's a very beautiful beach, and that ship crashed in that place, right? And as it crashed against some rocks, they couldn't proceed any further. And then, since they couldn't proceed any further, they decided, the senior merchants of the ship which crashed, decided to split the group of sailors into two. The first group was asked to remain behind and look after the remains of the ship, because there was high probability that it was going to be looted by some of the sailors or the locals. And then the second group was asked to go inland and identify a location where there's fertile soils and fresh supplies of water. So they came into this place and identified this location here, which is called the Company Gardens. This is the Company Gardens, a place which was set up by the Dutch. It is the heart of the city of Cape Town. It is because of this place that Cape Town has been established. Because had it not been established, or if they had not decided to settle here, maybe we could be having a different city altogether. Maybe Cape Town would not be here.
Will you say that this is the first ever settlement?
Yes.
Like this is where Cape Town started
Yes. Yes, this is the heart of Cape Town, the roots. Because when they identified this location, they didn't know how long they were going to settle here, but ultimately they settled for a period of slightly over 9 months while they were waiting for a rescue ship, either on its way from Netherlands to India or from India, fully laden with cargo of spices back to Netherlands.
And after more than 9 months, they were rescued by Jan van Riebeck. That was not the end.
When they got back to the Netherlands, the two senior merchants of the ship which was stranded here at the Cape, who were settled here at the company gardens, were asked to provide a written report. Then they provided that report. At the end of the report, they also gave a recommendation to say it would make a lot of economic sense or business sense for the Dutch East India Company to set up a refreshment station at the Cape, which would in turn provide fresh supplies of food, water and medical services to all the sailors who were passing east and west by the southern tip of Africa.
And in 1652, he returned to the Cape Colony, which marks the genesis of slavery and colonization at the Cape.
So when they arrived here at the Cape, they took a much needed rest. On getting down to business, they discovered that they didn't have manual labor.
And on 1658, that is when the first ever slave ship arrived on the Cape Colony.
When you talk about the history of slavery in Africa, all I knew was Africans were enslaved and taken to Americas. But I never knew that Africans that were taken from different parts of Africa were actually brought in South Africa.
They were embarking on what was called slaving expeditions. They would go to places like India, Indonesia, small islands of archipelago, and also places like Angola and Mozambique. What does it mean? It means that was then the introduction of slavery at the Cape.
Upon arrival, they were stripped of their identities, often renamed after the month they arrived or their country of origin, and more alarmingly, reduced to commodities.
So whenever the slaves were brought to the Cape, they were given new names, right? I want you to take a look here. The names of the new slaves would also depict where they are coming from. In other words, the origins.
Yeah.
Right. Say, for example, if I'm given a new name, they'll give me a new name, and then my surname will be where I come from. This one is Corn Van Angola. Yes.
So which means that
So which means Corn was the new name, and then is the slave who
Angola.
came from Angola. So this is how they used to give the names of to the slaves. And also besides that, some of the slaves were given the names of the day when they landed at the Cape. If you arrive at the Cape on Monday or Tuesday, you can be given that name. That's why you see there are some people who are called Monday, right? And then the surname will be the place where they're coming from. Or they will give you the name of the month which you arrived at the Cape as slaves.
In fact, many of Cape Town's slave descendants remain unaware of the origins of their names, reflecting a disconnect from their rich yet painful heritage.
It brings up emotions because that will always be a question within your mind. What was my surname? Seeing that I'm not here in October, it's almost like a step. I'm a stepson, was step in some way and I would like, if possible, before anything happens, to find out really what my surname, would I ever be able to find out who I was really.
I also remember at school, children would be like January, February, March, April and sing the surnames like the Kapse would as well. And it's just something that you kind of shrug off and you ignore it after a while. But it's still surname September.
this is mind-blowing, man. Literally, if you've been to Ghana, Cape Coast Castle and Milner Castle where slaves were kept, it's exactly the same thing. And this is right here in Africa, and I had no idea. When I went in there, I was blown away, even though we cannot put the camera in there, but it tells you the story of where the people were kept.
This is the second oldest existing colonial structure in Cape Town, the Slave Lodge. Built in 1679, it housed the slaves who belonged to the Dutch East India Company. Very little is known of the people who lived at the lodge, and only around half of their names were found, but nothing more than where they came from and their dates of death. Today the lodge is a museum that tells the story and commemorates the history of slavery in South Africa and further afield.
what would happen is most of these slaves were coming from those areas, and then at the Cape, it was considered a halfway distance. This is where the slave masters would go through a selection process. So those who were able to do the entire trip from where they were being brought from, like from India all the way to Europe, then they would be put on one side. But those who were beginning to become frail because of the harsh conditions out at sea, then they would be selected and offloaded and sold to the Dutch East India Company at the Cape. Because obviously they wouldn't make the entire trip because they were being treated very harshly and they were crammed, like sardines in the ships, and most of them, they were dying and they were throwing out of the ships.
Hundreds of thousands of people were transported across the globe on vessels just like this, under horrendous conditions.
They were packed in like cattle, probably sometimes even worse. They obviously tried to get as many people in on the ship for profit's sake. In fact, some of the captains worked in a percentage of loss. In other words, they realized that some of the people are going to die on the voyage, and therefore they packed in as many as they could. You can just think a small, enclosed, dark space at sea. You've never been to sea. Not very good food, no toilets, terrible situation.
So for them to make some money out of the slaves, they had to select those who were still fit enough to do the entire trip to Europe or to the Caribbean or to Europe, USA, and those who were not fit enough were being offloaded and sold to the Dutch East India Company at the Cape.
The Oxford Dictionary describes a slave as, among others, a person who is the legal property of another that is bound to absolute obedience and a helpless victim of some dominating influence.
At the Cape especially, you had two types of slaves. You had the slaves that worked for the Dutch East India Company, so they were not necessarily traded. But then you had slaves that were sold to the farmers, and they were sold at various times for different sums of money. But what happened was the farmers or the slave owners who had slaves could then hire out their slaves, especially if they were skilled. If you had a slave that was a blacksmith, you could hire him out and make money out of him. The slave didn't get anything, but the owner did. So they were regarded as property, and therefore you could do with your property as you pleased.
When they are being sold to the Dutch Indian Company, what were they doing in this company? What were they doing?
Right. When they were being sold to the Dutch East India Company at the Cape, it was actually meant to provide labor.
But I mean, they brought like a huge significance, I mean, to the development of Cape Town. So most of them actually were responsible working in the farms, also maybe in the households, as well as like factories, as well as maybe like things like construction companies actually. So they would have to provide labor to that.
And then when they do that, most of them were actually being employed in the farms because the Dutch who had settled at the Cape were then given lots of pieces of land where they were farming, be it cattle or vegetables and fruit and anything, which was compulsory that they must sell all their farm produce to the Dutch East India Company. And then the Dutch East India Company would in turn sell to the sailors who were selling east and west and southern tip of Africa. So these slaves were being kept very, very busy all the time.
So it means that all the slaves were kept in here?
Yes.
So you leave from here to work every morning?
Right. This is where they used to be housed, and at one point in time, this place used to house more than 4,000 slaves.
Wow.
Until it was then under the British, because the British were also part of political leadership at the Cape for 2 occasions, since there were a total of 4 wars which were fought at the Cape. And then when the British secretary did discover that these slaves were living like, sardines, and they were crammed in there, very filthy, he decided to write a report that these people are totally living in inhuman conditions, even though they were not considered as 100% humans, because slaves were actually treated like any other, like cows, donkeys and stuff, and they were on the same inventory with cows, donkeys and stock. So this is the slave tree monument. So this place used to be the site of the slave tree where the slaves were being auctioned. So the government decided to cut it down and build this monument so that it will last forever. And then a lot of people would come and see the place where the slaves were being auctioned. And these slaves were being auctioned here depending on the qualities or the characteristics of where they come from. And they were actually advertised in the local newspapers just like any other stock, like cows, you know, which are being auctioned.
From the 1650s to 1830s, the Cape was a slave society. Popular history records the existence of a tree or trees in Church Square, under which slaves were sold. Slaves not needed by the company and those of private owners were traded or sold in any other properties that might be. These slaves were like livestock auctions. Wow.
The Cape was not intended to be a colony, but a refreshment station, so the local population could not be enslaved.
Right. So one of the most important points is that when slavery was introduced at the Cape, it was on one condition. The Dutch were not allowed to enslave the local population. And who are the local population? We are talking of the Khoisan. That is the natives of this place, not any of these black people who you see in South Africa who are part of the great Bantu migration, who migrated from up north. So these locals, the natives of this place, the Khoisan, were now used by the Dutch as the police officers of the Dutch. In other words, whenever slaves used to run away, because it used to happen quite often, because they were being treated very harshly and they were living under extreme harsh conditions. And then the locals, the Khoisan, were being used as the police officers. That was very much based on their expert knowledge of the field craft. In other words, they were very good at tracking those people who would have run away in the forests. You know, they were very good at even tracking wild animals and also hunting wild animals.
The relationship between the Dutch and the Khoisan were very positive, as the Dutch had to barter for fresh meat.
The Dutch grew the vegetables themselves, but began trading with the local people for meat, many of whom were Khoisan. But the relationship soured because the Dutch started grabbing land which did not belong to them, and encouraging Dutch farmers to move to the Cape. By 1657, the Dutch started allocating farms to European settlers in and around Cape Town. They became known as the Boers.
3 different conflicts erupted between the Dutch and the Khoisan as a result of the appropriation of land by the white farmers, currently known as the Boers. That led to the loss of many lives of the Khoisan.
And they brutally murdered the Khoi.
That is your tribe?
Yes, they impregnated some of our brothers and sisters. And yeah, that's how they also, like, you know, put their bloodline within, you know, to colonize, like, the city, the lineage, yeah. Wow.
The trust between the Dutch and the Khoisan was broken, and eventually the Khoisan were enslaved by the Dutch. This city, the farms, and the towns were built over almost 200 years by the enslaved people that were living in the Cape Colony.
So from here, going this way, this is the first street in South Africa. It is called Adderley Street, and it is the first street at the Cape, which used to connect 2 of the most important parts of the Cape. That is the Company Gardens and the Castle of Good Hope, which is the oldest standing colonial building, which was built by the Dutch between 1667 and 1672.
What used to happen in here?
So in this place here, almost everything used to happen here. It was an administrative center, which was used as a place which was used as a parliament, a place where they used to do church services, a place where they used to do meetings, like for the parliament at the Cape. And besides that, it is a place which used to be a court where they were trying cases, and they would imprison anyone who would have transgressed, and also hang anyone who would have transgressed. And also some of the people were confined to solitary confinement. We do have the prisons and the solitary confinement.
a slave or somebody who has done any crime would have been chained against this wall, the original wall, and to confess to the clerk of the court whether he's guilty or not. So this torture chamber was to get a confession of guilt or not guilt out of them. So there would be this chain, but the worst of them is probably this one, the pulley. The assistants of the court of the clerk would bring this pulley down, and a prisoner would be chained to this pulley, head down and feet up, and would be hanged there, so the blood would rush through your head.
Yes, this place was also used for roll call for slaves. And how was it used? Every slave who was actually part of the Dutch East India Company, they actually belonged to a group, and every group had a team leader. And the team leader was supposed to have names, a list of names of the slaves. And when they would go out in the morning, they would first of all check who is available. And if there are a group of 20 slaves, and excluding the leader, at the end of the day, when they come back again, they would go through that whole list to find out who is available and who is not. And if ever they check that one of the slaves is not available, then they will ask the authorities to send the police officers in the form of these natives of this place, the Khoisan, who use it to track these slaves and find them.
You have to choose between guilty or not guilty, or life and death. If you admit to guilt, and it's a serious crime, so you would either be put under the gallows and hanged to death, or you would be staked alive. You know what staking is? They put a pole up you, and you are hang out there to death. But the vultures from Table Mountain would come down and peck on your flesh until you are dead. So it's horrific what all the people went through, but especially the enslaved people.
As we drive in between the majestic mountains of Cape Town and the beautiful Indian Ocean, I was like, oh my goodness, this reminds me of Tobago, because if you have been to Tobago before, you know that, I mean, that's how Tobago looks like. And guess what? I just saw Scarborough, and I'm like, that is Tobago. That is the capital city of Tobago. And I'm like, my goodness, I need to just get down to make this connection. So if you're from Trinidad and Tobago, I guess you need to visit Cape Town, because this place would definitely remind you of home.
Having Scarborough in Cape Town and Tobago has one thing in common: the presence of the British in both countries.
How did they come? Initially, they were from Britain. They settled in KZN, KwaZulu-Natal, where we've got Durban. When they settled there, they had big sugar plantations. So those sugar plantations were the reason why they settled in Durban. But on seeing that this place, which is called the Cape, is far much more strategic in terms of business, because this was a very, very busy place, because it has all the facilities where all these sailors were stopping over to get fresh supplies of food, water, and medical services. The British, being who they are, thought they are a superior race than the Dutch, and they are the ones who supposed to control that place, because there was no business where they were settled, but here it was a lot of business. So they decided to come to the Cape, and when they came to the Cape, then they fought with the Dutch.
Which year was slavery abolished in here?
Right. Slavery was abolished at the Cape when it was under the British in 1834. When it was abolished in 1834, the news of the abolishment of slavery was kept away from the slaves. They were not even told that you are now free. As a result, the owners of these slaves, they used to report scantily on the numbers of what? Of the slaves which they had. If one had 20 slaves, he would say, I've got 10 or 8 slaves. They were not being honest. So they decided to keep away the news of the abolishment of slavery to the slaves. And then instead of telling them that now you are free, they told them that from now onwards, you are going to be free only after completing your second phase as an apprentice under a different title. Do you know that according to the laws of apartheid here in South Africa, television was only introduced in 1976. Nobody was allowed to watch a television or to own a television set in South Africa, even the white communities, right? Why? Because they didn't want them to know what was happening in other parts of the world, in other parts of Africa. That other countries, like neighboring countries like Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Malawi, or whatever, even Ghana, is the first nation which got independent in Africa. They didn't want South Africans to know that this is what is happening. As a result, television was totally banned. So in as much they could be able to do that during the time of slavery, they also managed to keep away the news of the abolishment of slavery at the Cape.
A major discovery was, however, made in 2012 when the slave ship São José was identified, just beyond the crashing waves of one of Cape Town's most scenic beaches, Clifton. The vessel is the first identified slave wreck in South Africa. For over 200 years it lay hidden, slowly deteriorating, but finally its gruesome purpose was brought to light. More than 400 slaves en route from East Africa to Brazil were on board. When it was destroyed during a storm in 1794, it claimed the lives of more than 200 people. The slave trade was a major global undertaking that changed the world forever.
Realizing how much of an influence it has had to South Africa and the history of South Africa, slavery is the basis of apartheid to an extent. It's the basis of racism. And, to understand that properly, you need to understand slavery.
Slaves were brought to the Cape from across the globe, including Africa, Sri Lanka, and Malaysia. From the slave lodge at the bottom of Wales Street in Cape Town, one can see the colourful homes of the Boerkaap. Slavery is at the core of its history. It is, among others, as a result of slavery, the birthplace of an entirely new language, Afrikaans, and is the cradle of Islam in South Africa.
You need to have an identity so that you can stand tall, and more importantly, that you can sit as equals amongst others at the table. So if you don't know where you come from, you don't know which door to open or on which door to knock.
This exhibition is dedicated to the people who built the city of Cape Town, but they were not allowed to enjoy all the fruit of their labor.
The most colorful Instagrammable place in Cape Town was once a rental for free slaves.
This is Boerkaap, and by the way, Boerkaap is an Afrikaans word which means Upper Cape. It is called Boerkaap simply because it is on a higher ground. If you look at the landscape, it is on a higher ground compared to the city of Cape Town, which is on a lower ground.
Yeah.
Because this is at the foot of Signal Hill. So this place was established way back after the introduction of slavery at the Cape, and it was meant to provide rental accommodation for slaves.
It is said, whilst the slaves were renting, the houses had to be white.
Bro, this is Boerkaap in the past. Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. It was white. It was painted white. Oh.
It was white. Everything was white. He painted them white, so this was more like a signal or a sign to show that slaves are living in the area.
And when this rule was lifted, the slaves were allowed to buy the properties, and all the houses were painted with bright colors by the owners as an expression of their freedom.
And then they were now allowed to own properties around this place. Since they were now allowed to own properties around this place, they decided to color them or paint them in different colors as an appreciation of color, something which they were not able to do during the time they were slaves.
So that is how we came to have all these blue, pink, you understand? Wow. They did actually just to signify the independence or the freedom actually they've gained after all the troubled times.
I learned a lot making this video, and I believe that you learned so much watching this video. If there's anything that you want to add to it, let's educate ourselves in the comment section. I'll be here to read that comment because I never knew South Africa got such a complex and a long history. I'm so glad you made it this far. Don't forget to like this video. I will see you all in the next one. Cape Town to the world.